Harold Brown watched his P-51 Mustang spiral toward the snow-covered field below, trailing smoke and debris. Only moments earlier, he'd been celebrating with his squadron mates as they decimated World War II supply trains. Quote, "I had that locomotive lit up like a Christmas tree." Now, he hung suspended from his parachute, floating down into enemy territory. As his boot touched the frozen ground, Brown found himself surrounded by German soldiers on skis, rifles trained on him. Behind them, a crowd of locals emerged, intent on revenge. "Here I come along as one of the pilots," Brown would later recall. "They wanted a piece of me." Those in front suddenly froze, their expressions transforming from rage to shock. "Impossible," someone whispered. "So the rumors are true." The pilot standing before them wasn't what they expected. He wasn't who they expected at all. Hitler's secret weapon. As Hitler prepared to seize control of Europe in the late 1930s, he was working on a secret weapon, one that promised to grant his Luftwaffe complete and unchallenged dominance of the skies. German engineers had begun developing an aircraft unlike anything before it. It was meant to be the most advanced and powerful combat aircraft of its time, capable of reaching speeds up to 560 miles per hour and armed to the teeth with an array of guns, rockets, and bombs. This was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet-powered fighter, and the last thing the United States wanted to see hovering over its cities. Before the jet was finished, on September 1st, 1939, more than 2,500 Luftwaffe aircraft descended on Polish cities and supply lines. Fighters and bombers struck without restraint, obliterating infrastructure, communication hubs, and civilian towns before Poland could even mount a proper defense. In less than a month, the collapse of the country was inevitable. While Warsaw was still under siege, Hitler flew to the front lines aboard his personal Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor. Gazing out from above, he marveled at the devastation his air forces had brought. The campaign had confirmed his belief. He had enough air power to pave the way toward total European domination. Still, there were hopes to counter the Nazi advance before the war bled to the rest of the world. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced in a radio broadcast that the United Kingdom would go to war against Germany, accusing Hitler of launching an unprovoked attack. Quote, "His action shows convincingly that there is no chance of expecting that this man will ever give up his practice of using force to gain his will. He can only be stopped by force." Still, across the Atlantic, the United States remained neutral, unwilling to challenge the Nazi menace that was rapidly consuming an entire continent. But even after adopting a policy of isolationism, Americans understood that the battle might one day reach their shores. If Hitler turned his gaze westward, the U.S. would need more than resolve. It would need a weapon capable of challenging the most fearsome air force in the world. Off to school. As the Nazi flag was raised across Paris, the United States launched the first peacetime draft in its history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed legislation that required all American men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for military service. Many of the young men called to serve the armed forces had never so much as held a gun in their lives, but through grueling training, they were transformed into disciplined soldiers, ready to fight if the call came. But defeating Hitler would demand more than just infantry. Across the country, aviation schools filled up with cadets preparing to go head-to-head with the elite pilots of the Luftwaffe. Their training began with basic military instruction, followed by 6 months of academic courses taught on college campuses. Math, physics, navigation, and military science laid the foundation they would need for the battles ahead. Next came pre-flight school, typically held at military bases like Maxwell Field in Alabama. There, cadets studied the science of flight, learned to interpret charts, decipher Morse code, and identify enemy aircraft. They were drilled on military law and customs and trained with .45 caliber pistols, .30 caliber carbines, and Thompson submachine guns. Only after passing these trials would cadets begin flight training, first in a link trainer simulator, and then in a PT-17 Stearman biplane. Within 10 to 13 hours of flight time, cadets were expected to fly solo, being immediately expelled if they failed to do so. For those who succeeded, a rite of passage awaited, with classmates dunking the freshly landed pilot headfirst into a barrel filled with rainwater. As training progressed, cadets had to master increasingly complex maneuvers: stalls, spins, snap rolls, forced landings, loops, and crosswind landings. They were required to complete 60 hours of flight and a minimum of 175 landings, culminating in a final evaluation flight with an Army pilot officer. Only the best made it through, and out of the 317,000 cadets who began the journey, just 193,000 would complete the program, ensuring that only the best pilots became flight officers. However, flight school graduate celebrations turned bitter on December 7, 1941, as over 300 Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack. Battleships burned, airfields exploded, and the illusion of distance from the war that once protected the United States shattered. America had been officially drawn into the combat, and now the young pilots were bound to face the Axis up in the skies. New blood. Traditionally, African Americans had little chance to participate in most combat roles, and no black cadet had ever served as a U.S. military pilot. But with Hitler's forces knocking on America's doorstep, the country could no longer afford to ignore the untapped talent waiting to be enlisted. The War Department approved the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first all-black flying unit in U.S. history. Its training would take place in Tuskegee, Alabama. In March 1941, the program was already in the headlines as First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited the facilities, requesting a flight with Chief Civilian Flight Instructor C. Alfred Anderson. The chief took her up in a Piper J-3 Cub, circling the skies above the fields of Alabama. When they landed, the First Lady stepped out of the plane smiling, turned to Anderson, and declared, quote, "Well, you can fly all right." Still, Tuskegee pilots would need more than the First Lady's seal of approval before proving themselves ready to go against Hitler's forces. Tuskegee quickly became one of the most grueling training programs the Army Air Forces had ever assembled, with candidates being subjected to intense psychological screening, physical conditioning, and rigorous academic classes. As pilot Coleman Young, who would later become second lieutenant, declared, quote, "They made the standards so high, we actually became an elite group. We were screened and super screened." Flight training was scattered across multiple airfields. Primary instruction took place at Moton Field, where cadets first took to the skies to perform basic flight maneuvers under close supervision. Those who advanced moved on to Tuskegee Army Airfield, where the training intensified. There, cadets transitioned into faster and more complex aircraft, such as the AT-6 Texan and the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. Despite the determination of the cadets, the program faced immense challenges. Tuskegee Army Airfield had been built from the ground up in just 6 months, and while it was initially designed to support 500 personnel, by mid-1942 it was housing over 3,000 cadets and staff, stretching resources to the breaking point and prompting frequent changes in leadership, which disrupted the training pipeline and threatening the morale of the men who had come so far. However, things quickly shifted as responsibility fell upon Major Noel F. Parrish, a respected officer and instructor who was appointed as commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield. Unlike many of his predecessors, Parrish was determined to unleash the full potential of the pilots under his command, working tirelessly to improve facilities, streamline operations, and most critically, fight for the unit to be deployed. Ready for takeoff. Parrish's efforts paid off, and by April 1943, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was declared combat ready and deployed to the front lines of North Africa to join the more experienced 33rd Fighter Group. The veterans only gave the newcomers some basic pointers before their first mission in mid-1943 during Operation Corkscrew, a dangerous campaign to seize the heavily fortified Italian island of Pantelleria, crucial to the Allies' broader plan of invading Sicily. Pantelleria had eluded Allied control since 1940. Each previous attempt to neutralize it had been canceled by the presence of German fighters and anti-aircraft batteries spread across the Mediterranean. But now, with fresh American air power on the scene, the Allies believed a breakthrough was finally within reach. Yet this would be no easy victory. Over 12,000 Axis troops were dug into the island, protected by coastal artillery, radar-guided defenses, and 15 battalions equipped to annihilate any approaching threat. Even Eisenhower faced pushback for authorizing the mission. Still, he was determined to crush enemy resistance and prove the value of concentrated air power. The first wave of bombing raids started on May 18th. As the 99th Fighter Squadron took off for battle for the first time, they were tasked with escorting Allied bombers, conducting precision dive bombings, and attacking strategic ground targets. The Tuskegee pilots launched into battle, flying 2 sorties a day, diving through aggressive enemy fire. The opposing fighters came at them fast, but the 99th was ready. Their months of grueling training kicked in as they executed dazzling aerial maneuvers, rolling, diving, and juking through enemy fire with near supernatural precision, as they maintained formation and delivered their payloads while receiving minimal damage. For 3 weeks, Allied planes pounded the island with over 6,400 tons of bombs until the final phase began on June 11th, a full-scale amphibious invasion. British troops advanced toward the beaches, expecting a fierce battle, but as the landing craft neared the shore, the Allies discovered the Italians had already surrendered. The immense success of Operation Corkscrew convinced Allied leadership that air power alone could tilt the balance of the war. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the Northwest African Air Forces, even declared, quote, "The application of air power available to us can reduce to the point of surrender any first-class nation now in existence within 6 months from the time that pressure is applied." The 99th Fighter Squadron's stellar debut did not go unnoticed. At the conclusion of the operation, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the squadron's commander, was praised by Area Commander Colonel J.R. Watkin, who said, quote, "I wish to extend to you and the members of the squadron my heartfelt congratulations for the splendid part you played in the Pantelleria show. You have met the challenge of the enemy and have come out of your initial christening into battle stronger and more qualified than ever." The Tuskegee Airmen were just warming up. An ace raises. A year after their first combat mission, the 99th was folded into the larger and more lethal 332nd Fighter Group, a unit composed of other squadrons trained at Tuskegee. Flying P-51 Mustangs with bold red tails that earned them the nickname Red Tail Angels from the Allies, and which became a symbol of inescapable destruction by the Axis, the 332nd Fighter Group quickly got a reputation for being one of the most efficient squadrons flying over Europe. However, on October 12, 1944, their legacy would be challenged. After completing a bombing run over northern Italy, the Red Tails were en route back to base above Lake Balaton, Hungary, when suddenly a challenger appeared on the horizon, a massive pack of German Messerschmitt Bf-109s streaking right toward the Americans. Among the returning formation was Lieutenant Lee Andrew Archer Jr., flying as wingman to Captain Wendell Pruitt. Glancing at the incoming German planes, Archer recalled thinking, quote, "Well, this might be it." The two forces collided, and the aircraft spiraled and dove. 50 caliber tracers zipped across the sky, and the sound of machine gun fire drowned out the growl of the engines. Archer and Pruitt locked eyes on a single enemy fighter and gave chase, peeling off from the group in a synchronized dive. Archer attempted a direct head-on intercept, but the German pilot was no rookie. He veered off, drawing the Americans into a white-knuckle, high-speed chase that twisted above the lake. The Mustangs hugged each turn tightly, trying to box the Bf-109 in. Finally, Archer fired. A burst of gunfire tore through the German's fuselage. Moments later, the pilot ejected, his aircraft tumbling below. There was no time to celebrate, as another enemy fighter immediately came in from the flank, lining up a perfect shot on Pruitt. The captain's instincts kicked in, cutting speed to cause the German to overshoot. As the enemy dove away to recover, the Tuskegee duo wheeled around sharply, their Mustang arching across the sky in a turn that now placed the Germans squarely in their sights. Before Pruitt could pull the trigger, a third Bf-109 dove from above. But Archer was ready, as he recalled, quote, "The other one came in to get on Pruitt's tail, not realizing that my only job at the time was to protect Pruitt's tail." Archer rolled hard, slid in behind the attacker, and unleashed a salvo. The German aircraft shuddered, then spiraled downward while trailing smoke. Seconds later, Pruitt finished off the second fighter they'd cornered earlier, sending it tumbling below. But Pruitt wasn't done fighting. Archer recalled, quote, He made a screaming turn toward where all the other aircraft were, and I really wasn't sure that was a great idea at the time. At the heart of the battle, Archer briefly lost sight of Pruitt, but there was no time to look for him, as the enemy had their sights set on him. As Archer attempted to corner and dodge enemy aircraft, he spotted a lone enemy fighter and went after it. As the P-51 closed in, the German aircraft dipped toward a nearby runway, but Archer was already lining up his strike, and just before the wheels of the German aircraft could touch down, the enemy plane was hit, skidding across the tarmac as it exploded. By the time the battle ended, Lee Archer was credited with 5 confirmed victories, making him the first Tuskegee program graduate to earn the title of Ace. Fallen from the skies. But not all was glory for the Tuskegee Airmen, and as the Allies closed in on the final victory in Europe, some members of the 332nd Fighter Group found themselves on the wrong side of the battlefield. In early 1945, combat pilot Harold Brown and his squadron were dispatched to strike the final arteries feeding Hitler's war machine, German supply lines snaking along the southern border. As the formation reached the target zone, they found a bomber pilot's dream, a labyrinth of cargo trains, packed and exposed, ready to be destroyed. As the first bombs fell, Brown's radio crackled with ecstatic voices from fellow airmen. Quote, "Look what we got. Boy, I got this one. Hey, I just blew up one." Caught in the adrenaline of the moment, Brown spotted a train the other pilots had ignored. Without hesitation, he dove like a hawk as his aircraft opened fire. Quote, "I had that locomotive lit up like a Christmas tree, and just as I pulled up to go over it, that's when it exploded." The detonation was bigger than what Brown had anticipated, and before he could regain altitude, shrapnel from the exploding train reached his aircraft. In an instant, all instruments flickered, alarms went off, and his control system spiraled out of control. His aircraft was dying in midair. With no ejection seat to save him, Brown had to act fast. As the engine gave in, he rolled the plane inverted, then pitched the nose upward to bleed off speed. With a practiced hand, he jettisoned the canopy, released his harness, and let gravity do the rest. The wind howled as the cockpit vanished. As he floated down beneath his parachute, Brown watched his aircraft crashing down. He had survived, but his struggle was just beginning. The moment he hit the snow-covered ground, German soldiers on skis, rifles slung over their shoulders, were already on him. He was marched to a nearby village, one that had been partially damaged by the very air raids Brown had helped carry out. Brown later said, quote, "Here I come along as one of the pilots. They wanted a piece of me." But as the angry crowd closed in, one of the German guards suddenly stepped forward, drawing his weapon on the mob, holding them back before they could execute the Tuskegee Airmen on the spot. He was instead taken as a prisoner of war. Harold Brown became one of the 32 Tuskegee Airmen captured by enemy forces during the war, forced to endure brutal conditions and relentless interrogations in various camps. But even behind enemy lines, these men knew all they had to do was wait. The Last Stand. On March 24th, 1945, with the war entering its final act, 43 Tuskegee Airmen climbed into their P-51 Mustangs once more. This time, their task consisted of escorting a formation of B-17 bombers deep into the German capital. The target, a Daimler-Benz tank factory inside Berlin. Though the Nazi war machine was crumbling, the German capital remained heavily guarded, with Luftwaffe defenses set to strike intruders with fleets of FW-190 fighters and rocket-powered Me-163 Comets. Still, the Tuskegee Airmen were up for the challenge. After crossing about 800 miles across enemy skies, the fleet finally saw the distant skyline of Berlin, along with the first waves of German defenders coming their way. The Tuskegee Airmen sprang into action, guarding the bombers against the advancing threat. But as the enemy came closer, the American pilots felt a knot in their stomachs upon noticing the silhouette of a peculiar fighter approaching at blistering speed. This was Hitler's long-promised jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. Faster than any American fighter and heavily armed, the Me-262 could tear through bomber formations before their gunners had a chance to react, posing the biggest threat the Tuskegee Airmen had ever faced. As the bombers closed in on their target, German fighters launched into offensive maneuvers, twisting and climbing, seeking to cut the bombers down before they could release their payloads. Among them, the Me-262s streaked like bullets, inching dangerously close to the American aircraft. One of the German jets set their gaze on a single B-17, pointing its guns at it as it closed the distance. Roscoe Brown pushed his Mustang to the edge, and just as the jet lined up its shot, Brown pulled beneath it, right into firing position. Before the German pilot could react, Brown squeezed the trigger, and the Me-262 erupted in flame, its pilot ejecting as the wreckage spiraled downward. Brown later explained, quote, "The maneuver I used in shooting down the jet is a maneuver I practiced in some of our dogfights back at our home base, so it was almost second nature." It had taken the Nazis years to unveil their secret weapon, but by then, America had forged a weapon of its own. The Tuskegee Airmen, once dismissed and under-equipped, had mastered the art of aerial warfare, and on that day, at 25,000 feet above Berlin, they had proven that not even the most advanced German aircraft was safe from their guns. A little over a month after the Tuskegee Airmen participated in this operation, Berlin officially fell. By the end of the war, it was reported that the Tuskegee program had yielded 1,007 pilots who helped the Allies defeat Hitler. However, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen didn't end after World War II concluded. In the following decades, many of the pilots who flew over Europe aboard red-tailed Mustangs made their way to other battlefields, carrying on the legacy of this legendary team and helping the American Air Forces keep their dominance across the skies. Years later, Lieutenant Ahmed A. Raymer Jr. would express, quote, "I got an opportunity to fly, something I've always wanted to do. I'd like to tell that I played a part on making these United States a better place to live for everybody."